Blessing Church, you're already ready to go, aren't you? I don't have to say how you're doing. You're already saying you're doing great. I want to welcome everybody that's joining from all of our locations. We are so glad that you're joining. And we just made an announcement here at the 48th Street campus, and I want to make sure that that's known at all of our other campuses. I'm going to be talking about a shocking statement of Jesus having to do with marriage, divorce, remarriage, and adultery. So if you don't want to have like really provocative conversations with your children and you brought them in to the worship service with you, this would be a great time to check them into the children's location. And that'll save you some of those conversations later. They already know that here. But we all, the things that we're going to be discussing here today are really critically important to understand. You know, shocking statements do something, no matter what they are. They create emotional responses. When you make a shocking statement, it creates an emotional response. Comedians have figured this out. You know, a lot of times comedians will take the short route to get laughter. And if they can make you feel uncomfortable, that's why so many like jokes they tell are sexual in nature, because they know that if they can make you uncomfortable by shocking you with the statement, one of the ways we respond emotionally is through laughter. Another way that we might respond when a shocking statement comes to us is just by being confused. Like, is that really what that person meant? I need some clarification. I need a better understanding of what you're really trying to say and where you're coming from. Another response that's emotional to a shocking statement that might be made would be anger, because it might hurt my feelings, or I might take it personally, and maybe that was intended. Maybe that shocking statement was intended for a person to take it personally. We need to understand that shocking statements can create emotional responses. And Jesus makes a lot of shocking statements, tells a lot of stories that have shocking conclusions, and they provoke emotional responses. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's exactly what happens. There are emotional responses to what Jesus says. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, and a lot of people say the Sermon on the Mount was the best sermon that was ever preached, I would agree with that. But the Sermon on the Mount is a greatest hits of shocking statements. Do you realize that? I mean, it's just like rapid fire. It's like machine gunning shocking statements. Let's just take a moment and look at what it says in the Sermon on the Mount. I just want to start in Matthew chapter 5. Start in verse 27. Jesus says this: "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." What? Jesus, I have a question. "And if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." Jesus, I mean, did you just say for me to, and if your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you, for it is better if you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Are you telling me that I'm supposed to get, and it was said, "Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery." Did you just say that I would make my innocent, and I'm not done yet. "And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." What exactly does that? "And again, you've heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord.' But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by earth, for it's the footstool of his feet." Look at verse 38. "And you have heard that it was said, 'An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth.' But I say to you, do not resist an evil person." What are you trying to say, Jesus? "But I say to you, whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn him the other also. If anyone wants to sue you to take your shirt, let him have your coat as well." I would like to understand what, in verse 43, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that may be sons of your... Okay, Jesus, you got me gouging out my eye because I'm lusting after, and I've got one foot off, and I have one hand off, and I can't tell anybody how I'm feeling if they... I don't get it. Jesus is just saying one shocking statement after another. And it has to be knocking people off the rails. I mean, people are trying to understand one of those statements, and he's already to the fourth one or the fifth one, and he just keeps moving forward. People were wondering, what are you actually saying? It had to be creating some amazing confusion. What does this mean? What does that mean? You know, a couple of sermon series ago, I was doing a series called Before and After. How many of you remember that series, all of our locations, about marriage? And the last one in the series was After I Say I Quit. It was before you say I do, after you say I do, before you say I quit, and after you say I quit. And when I talked about after you say I quit, I used the story of the woman at the well. And one of the things that we recognize from the Word of God with the story of the woman at the well is that Jesus said, when he said, come back and bring your husband, and she said, I have no husband. And Jesus said, yeah, that's true. You speak correctly when you say you have no husband. The reality is you've been married this many times, and the man that you're living with right now isn't your husband. So what I said in that sermon was that Jesus recognized the fact that this woman had been married multiple times. I got mail for that. I got mail for that because some people were saying, oh, so what you're saying, Jerry, then, is that it's okay, that Jesus was saying okay. It never says that Jesus said it was okay. He was just recognizing the reality. He was just saying, this is the truth, right? And she had to figure that. So I never really addressed the issue of whether or not, what about divorce and what about remarriage and how does all that work, but I'm going to do that today. Because that's the shocking statement that we're going to be discussing. And I know that I am on really shaky ground. Because this is a sermon better not preached. It's going to affect you. It affects my family. It affects people that I love, that I'm related to, that grew up in my house. It affects you. It affects your family. Maybe affecting you right now, and you're going, I just rather not hear that. But that's what Jesus said, and we have to understand what he said, and it is certainly a shocking statement. I want us to go back to verse 31 and 32, Matthew 5. How shocking is this? It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. What? You mean if you don't like the way she baked the cookies, if you don't like the way she made dinner and you decide to divorce her, you make her an adulteress? If I'm the one doing the sinning, if I'm the one that leaves for somebody else, if I'm the one who makes a choice to do that, how in the world am I taking her and making her into that? That's a shocking statement. Are you getting this? What in the world are you talking about? And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. You're not going to preach on that, are you, Jerry? Yeah, I am. Yeah, I am. What in the world is Jesus doing here? What kind of a lid is he taking off of a can of worms? You know, the Pharisees thought the same thing. When the Pharisees heard, these Jewish religious leaders heard Jesus say that and knew that Moses had said, this is the procedure. If you're going to divorce your wife, this is the procedure that you go through. Then Jesus was setting himself up as greater than Moses. And they saw in that an opportunity to attack Jesus. Now, I want us to move from Matthew 5 to Matthew 19, because it takes the Pharisees from Matthew 5 to Matthew 19 to put together an argument that they can bring back to Jesus to try to entrap him. So let's go to Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus has to explain this to the Pharisees. Verse 3, Matthew 19:3. It's awful quiet in here. Is it quiet at all our other locations? Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." Those of you that have been married, how many of you heard those words at your wedding? Yeah, a lot of you, probably at all our locations, a lot of you heard those exact words or something very close to those words. So the question that comes to Jesus that the Pharisees have been working on in order to entrap him, because they see this difference between what he's saying and what Moses said, is this: "Tell us, teacher, when is divorce permissible?" When is divorce permissible? How does Jesus answer? He answers with the 4th verse where it says, "Have you not read?" Basically, he's going, this information is already available to you. This information has something that God has already given. This has already been taught. Did you miss this? Did you not get this? What is that saying to you, to me? It's saying this: maybe there's something about marriage that you guys do not understand. You're so concentrated on the law of Moses and what God said through Moses that maybe you miss something far more profound. Now, this is what Jesus refers to. He goes back to the book of Genesis, doesn't he? Because he says this: "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female?" And verse 5, "For this reason a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife. The two will become one flesh." You need to capture this, because this is the truth crux of the whole sermon. Marriage was something that God created before the fall. Marriage is something that God created inside the parenthesis of his perfection. Before there was ever sin in the world, before Adam and Eve ever sinned, God created marriage. As a matter of fact, God was the one who gave the first bride away. And Adam was the first person who ever came up with wedding vows. You remember what he said? "Now this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." All of the intricacy that God did. I mean, he could have created a woman out of anything, but he chose to create her out of Adam's rib. And it was just something that points back to two becoming what? One flesh, to become one flesh. This is part of God's divine plan, that two become one. It happened before sin entered the world, before the corruption of sin entered the world. It happened before all of that, and it was a perfect reflection of God's perfection. That's what it was. What Jesus is teaching is there's something here we haven't figured out, that God pre-wired mankind. He wired us, created us, made us. If you believe the book of Genesis, he made us that two would become one. That when a man and a woman came together sexually, emotionally, psychologically, physiologically, that God, within God's wonderful creation, was that these two would become one flesh. And it makes all the sense in the world. Makes all the sense in the world, because we are right now, today, the bride of Christ, right? if we are Christians, if we're called by his names, we're a bride of Christ. That means we are in a marriage relationship with Jesus Christ right now as the bride of Christ. And I want you to understand that that relationship from his side is still perfect. That relationship from his side is still perfect. What do I mean by that? He has never been unfaithful to us in any way. He has never wandered in his mind or in his heart. He has never done anything but absolutely keep his promise to us. So that relationship is still perfect from his point of view. Maybe not from ours, but from his point of view. So what God has done in his creation is made us, pre-wired us, so that when this happens, we become one. Now show me in the Bible where God has some sort of protocol where he can take that one and make it two again. Show me where God says, no problem. Here's what you do in order to take one flesh and make them two flesh again. It's not in there. We were not designed to be ripped apart again. We were designed for two to become one, and in that to glorify God, not to be made two again. You see, what's going on is that these Pharisees and even his own disciples are saying, what is permissible? When is it permissible to divorce? What Jesus is saying is this: you're asking the wrong question. You're asking the question of whether or not it's permissible, and what I'm putting back into your face is whether or not it's even possible. Wow. And you know what? Those of us that have personally experienced divorce know the truth of what I just said. You know that there's truth in that, right? Because even though you go through the legality, even though you divide the assets, even though you live in separate places, you get divided up into pieces. There are pieces of you that you don't get back. Isn't that right? You don't ever get them back. You can't give them back. You can't be the same as you were before. You've changed. You've changed. And those things you carry forward into future relationships that you had in past relationships. Why? Because you cannot stop what God created when he made us, that two would become one flesh. You can't stop that. It's a law of God's nature that defines the relationship that we have with him. You see, divorce and its after effects exist because marriage has been corrupted by sin. Divorce and its after effects exist because sexuality and marriage has been corrupted by sin. We know that marriage was intended by God to be a perfect picture of our relationship to him. And in that relationship, as I said before, God has never wavered. He has been perfectly faithful to us. He has never wandered, but we wander. We wander. We sin. So right now, many of us in this room and at all of our little locations right now are hanging out here, like, okay. Jesus has said something very provocative, and Jerry's teaching something that Jesus said that was very provocative, and I can feel emotion. I can feel emotion, right? Because it's a shocking statement, and it is creating an emotional response. So, who you pointing the finger at, Jerry? Who's guilty? Who's guilty? Some of us right now may think we're on the safe side of this line. Some of us may think, I'm good. Boy, those people out there, some of them right now, they're feeling it. I'm glad I'm not feeling it, right? Listen. I've only had a sexual relationship with one woman in my life, and that's my wife. And she was a virgin, and I was a virgin when we got married. So I have kept the rules, at least the way that you and I look at the rules. but not the way that Jesus looks at the rules. I am not on the right side of this line, and neither are you. You might think you are, but you're not. And I'm going to show you why you're not. Because of what Jesus said in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19. He said, if anyone divorces his wife except for sexual immorality or unchastity, depending upon which version you're looking at. If you're looking at the King James Version, it says except for fornication, right? Like that is the way out, like that's the exit ramp. And how many of us have heard that? Well, so-and-so did this and so-and-so did that, so that means I get out of marriage free card, right? That word in the Greek language is the word porneia. And it is a general word. There's a different word in the Greek language that the Bible uses for adultery. This is not that word. And Jesus uses that word both times. And what he's saying is that when we stray sexually, we're guilty. Remember what he said in Matthew 5? If you look at a woman to lust after her, you've committed adultery with her in your heart already. I'd like to say, hey, I never did that. But I can't, and neither can you. What I'm trying to say is that we are all guilty. Now, some of us have taken that guilt to a higher and a higher and a higher level, right? How many of you remember me talking about the 7 E's of sin, Charles Stanley's 7 E's of sin, right? And I talked about the entrance of a thought, the entertainment of the thought, the examination of the thought. Number 4 was the enjoyment of the thought. I want to do it. And I said that's where sin comes in, right? And every time you move from one of those E's to the next E to the next E, it gets harder to resist until the enjoyment of the thought, it has taken over in your mind. You see, that's where that, if you look at someone to want that, then you have already committed that sin. You have enjoyed the thought. But just because you've enjoyed the thought doesn't mean it doesn't get worse, right? Because the next and the 50 is to experience the thought. Now, when you've experienced the thought, the ramifications of that sin have gotten wider, right? Because now you're taking victims besides yourself. It isn't just you. Now it's all the people around you. And then you excuse the thought, or you rationalize the thought, which empowers other people to do the same thing that you do and say it's okay. And then you are enveloped by the thought, and the thought actually defines who you are. You are labeled by that thought. What I'm saying is, when we get on the other side of the line, whether we're just barely on the other side or way over on that side, we're on the other side of the line. We are all on the other side of this line. See, it's so easy for us to want to judge people who've been divorced or remarried and say, you didn't do this right, you didn't do that right. We are all guilty. There is no us and them. What Jesus is saying is there are only us. Only us. Only lawbreakers. We are all lawbreakers. We all fall short of God's glory. This is what God intended in the garden, but we've blown it. We have blown the garden. We have blown God's perfection. We've blown God's righteous ideal, and what we're left with is this corrupted version of what God intended to be perfection. In our best day, we fall short of it, and some of us are so far short of it that our lives reflect the pain of those choices. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 16, the Apostle Paul says this: if you have sexual relations with a prostitute, you have become one with her. And he even quotes the scripture of Jesus, that the two will become one flesh. What I'm saying is this: God's intention, God's hardwiring in your life and in my life create that reality. Well, What are you saying, Jerry? I'm saying that if you had premarital sex, you're on the other side of the line. If you've had extramarital sex, you're on the other side of the line. If you've been engaged in pornography, you're on the other side of the line. If you've lusted after someone, you're on the other side of the line. What I'm saying is you're on the other side of the line is what I'm saying. You getting that? We are all on the other side of the line. And what happens to us is our hearts, our spiritual selves is damaged because of it, because we were not intended for this. That we're hardwired to become one flesh, but we become one flesh over and over, and it's like we're slicing ourselves into pieces. Not at all what God intended. And so what do? We do exactly what the Pharisees did. We do exactly what everybody else did. We look for loopholes. Well, give me a reason when it's permissible. When is it okay? When is it okay for me to divorce my spouse? When is it okay? When are they so far over the line that it makes it all right? See, we do that because that's the result of our corruption. It's the result. How does God feel about divorce? The Bible's clear. He hates it. Actually says those 3 words in the book of Malachi. God hates divorce. How does God feel about remarriage? Well, you're never supposed to get divorced in the first place, so how do you think he feels about it? And some of you are going, well, okay, are you just picking on people who've been divorced or people who've been remarried? No, I'm picking on all of you, and I'm picking on myself, because we are all on the other side of this. We are all guilty. And why shouldn't Jesus tell us the truth about who we are? And what should this do to us? It should make us look at how Jesus treats those who have figured out that they are on the other side of the line. Like the woman at the well. I go back to that illustration. Jesus uses the testimony of the woman at the well to reach an entire community for the kingdom. A woman is brought before Jesus naked, thrown in front of him, caught in the act of adultery. And they're all ready to kill her. And Jesus says what? He that is without sin, let him cast the first stone. And when they all drop their rocks and walk away, he looks at the woman. He looks. Now, I don't think he ever does look at the woman. But he says, woman, where are your accusers? And then what does he say? Neither do I condemn you. Did she deserve condemnation? Did she deserve it? Somebody answer me. Did she deserve it? Did she deserve to be stoned to death? The law said that she deserved to be stoned to death. Is Jesus circumventing the law? Is Jesus blowing off the law? Or is Jesus providing the only thing for that woman that she needed, and that was grace? Is Jesus pointing the finger at you? You've been divorced. Is Jesus pointing the finger at you? You've been divorced and remarried. Is Jesus pointing the finger at you? Is Jesus saying, you deserve this? Well, if we look at it one way, yeah. Because we're all guilty. We are all guilty. But if you look at it the other way, and you see the response that Jesus had to our recognition of that truth, you'll see that the one thing he extends to us is not judgment, but grace. His grace that is greater than all of our sin. So, like the woman at the well, or the woman taken in adultery, I need His grace. I need His grace in my thought life. I need His grace in my marriage. I need His grace if I'm dealing with divorce or the after effects of divorce. I need His grace if I have remarried. I need His grace if I am single. I need His grace if I'm in a living arrangement that is outside of His will to see me through, to be inside of His will. And I want us to understand 5 steps of recovery. All right, I want you to get this. 5 steps of recovery. Step number one. Embrace the truth. This is a shocking statement that Jesus made, but it's true. It's true. And we need to understand the reality of this truth, that this is how God intended marriage to be. And we live in a world and in our own hearts, we're corrupted of that truth. We are corrupted. We're in a corrupted world, and a corrupted heart, and a corrupted body, and a corrupted life. Embrace the truth. And embracing the truth is not dodging it, it's accepting it. It's understanding it with my mind. The first beatitude, Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." To be poor in spirit means I have realized with my mind that I am a spiritually bankrupt person. Poor in spirit, I am spiritually bankrupt. It's not them or them. The only finger that should be pointing in your direction. I am a spiritually bankrupt person. Step number one. Step number two, I need to confess that I am a broken person and that I need healing. The second beatitude is this: blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. God is expecting you to have an emotional response to a mental truth. If you understand that you are poor in spirit, it should evoke an emotional response. And that's repentance. That's confession. That doesn't fix anything. It just recognizes the truth on an emotional level. Second beatitude. Third step, I have to relinquish control in my life. The third beatitude is this: blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The word meek means strength under control. What we have to understand is I have to relinquish my control and I have to turn my life over to God for His control. That means I don't want to operate by my own rules anymore. I want to operate by His rules. And what motivates me to do that? It's the place where my mind and my emotions come together. It's the place where I recognize I'm poor in spirit and I respond emotionally. My heart breaks and I confess my sin. And then I say, God, I need you to take over my life because I can't control this. Step number 4, ask for His grace. Jesus said, you have not because you ask not. He will give it. The fourth beatitude is this: blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. They shall be filled. When we understand that we're poor in spirit, when we respond to it emotionally by mourning, when we turn over control of our lives by saying, blessed are the meek, by being meek and turning the control over my life, then now your cup is empty and you can lift the empty cup up to the Lord and say, I'm asking you, I'm desperate for you. Fill my empty life up with your goodness and with your grace. And Jesus Christ will cover you with His grace. He'll cover you with His grace regardless of the circumstance of your life as it stands, regardless of the messes you've made, of the brokenness, of the victims. He will cover your life with grace. But he won't do it until you lift up your cup. And you can't fill a cup that is already full. And the only way you can get that cup empty is to pour it out. Poor in spirit, mourning and meekness, pours that cup out so that he can fill it with his righteousness. And number 5, let Christ shine out of you. Stop looking for permission to do things that God has said not to do, and start living your life as a response to his great grace. Another way I could say it is this way. In your life, be content with God first. You see, so many things in our life, we can't be content with God because it's got to be God and this, and God and that. It's like God isn't enough. Like I got to have all these other things to be content, and I'd like to have God too. And what he's saying is, I am enough. And if he is enough, then whatever he brings into your life in the future will be according to his will and not your own. If you have an empty cup that you lift up to the Lord and let him fill, then he will fill it with good things. He said that if even you and I, being evil, if our child would ask for a piece of bread, would we give him a stone? And then he said, if you, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your kids, how much will your Heavenly Father give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him? We don't have because we don't ask. We don't ask because our cups are already full of things that don't matter. And we need to learn that the thing that really matters is what only God can fill that cup with. Some of you right now are going to say, well, you never really answered the question. And it's because you're still looking for permission. Lay it down. Lay permission down. And just say, I want you. And he will provide the rest. We're moving to a time of decision.